Welcome back everyone to another Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing setup. In today's video, we're back in the midget cars at Woodley Motor Speedway. So for our second midget racing setup, I wanted to choose a track that was different than Arrowwood where we began. Woodley is only a quarter mile while still having enough banking that you can easily run this track wide open. So the purpose of today's video is to give you an opportunity to compare and contrast the setup we used at Arrowwood with the setup we're going to use at Woodley, and give you an opportunity to figure out a baseline that you can use for really most any type of track. Woodley lends itself to some very quick lap times. In fact, my quicker laps are in the 10.2 range, 10.22, 23, somewhere in that range. So very quick lap times, particularly if you get the line right. Generally, when you want to use as much of the straightaway, be as far to the right on the straightaway as you can, and then bring the car down to the apex right at the bottom of the track through the corners, and then let the car drift up again toward the outside of the track on the exit. That's how you're going to maintain maximum speed. As I mentioned at the beginning, you're easily going to be wide open around this track, so it is imperative that you maintain momentum. We'll begin our setup discussion with the shock values. And here you see similar values to what we showed at Arrowwood. The bumps are really not an issue here at this track, so feel free to use much higher numbers if you prefer a tighter feel out of the car, quicker reactions from the car, particularly when you're on corner entry and corner exit. For me, I generally prefer to use softer values in the shocks across the board, but again, like always, I do not tune individual corners of the car, since that is going to be up to you to tune the car to make it feel exactly the way you want it to feel. But again, overall, my preference is for a softer feel, which is why I use the lower values overall. Moving on to the weight settings, maximum left side weight and minimum front weight. So again, I wanted a little bit more rotation out of the car here. We've got a shorter track, and I'm going to need the car to rotate a little bit quicker and be looser overall, so that I can make sure I get from the outside of the track on the straightaways all the way down to the bottom at the apex of the corner. So the minimum front weight works very well for me here. However, if you find that the car is just too loose overall, then one of your options to tighten it up or make it more stable overall is to increase this front weight number to 39.0 or even the maximum of 39.5. The cross weight very close to the maximum, but not quite at the 55.0% max. Again, I needed the car to rotate a little bit quicker, so I backed off that number just a little bit by only a percent. But again, if you need the car to rotate more overall and a little bit quicker, then drop this down around 53, 52 and see how the car responds. Front and rear heights, not really an issue here unless you find yourself getting a little bit too low in the corners where you drop off the banking and really start to get into the infield area where you might see some bottoming out. But otherwise, really a non-issue as far as the height, so I left them at the minimums. Moving on to the torsion bars, you're going to see the minimums on both the left front and the left rear, which is more traditional for me, something that I like the feel of better overall. One thing you will notice is that in this case, both the right front and the right rear are both at 1.0. Generally, my preference is to run only one tick of difference between the left rear and the right rear. That's to tighten the car up. So the bigger the difference between the left rear and the right rear, the looser the car will be overall, and particularly from the center of the corner to exit. So here, again, I wanted the car to rotate a little bit more, be a little bit looser. So that's why I used a little bit higher setting for the right rear. Also on the preload, you notice that I'm using maximum preload on the right front. That's just to keep things stable and tighten the car up just a little bit and give me a little bit better feel on corner entry. But then you notice that the left rear preload is at 2.0, and that's just to tighten the car up, give me a little bit more side bite coming off the corner. So if you feel like the car is just too tight overall, particularly if you feel on the entry to the corner the car is too tight, then drop this number down to around 2.0 or even lower on the right front, and that will certainly loosen the car up. On the other hand, if you feel like the car is just too tight on exit, then drop this left rear preload down to a 1.0 or even lower, and that will certainly free the car up on exit. Tire pressures, I did very little testing here, basically because the other settings that I was using got me the feel that I needed and the speed that I needed overall. But in general, the tire pressures that I would recommend trying different things with, if you're going to get into the tire pressures, would be the right front and the right rear. In general, if you feel like the car is just too loose overall, you don't have enough right rear grip, then drop this right rear pressure to something like 6 or even lower, as I do at a lot of tracks, down to something like 4.0, and that should certainly tighten the car up overall. On the right front, I use this a lot of time to dictate the corner entry and also the stability in the car overall. So if you feel like the car is just too loose overall, then increase this number to around 14 or 15 or even higher and see if that doesn't tighten up the car and give it more stability. On the other hand, if you want to loosen the car up, particularly on the entry of the corner, then drop this number down to around 9 or 10 and see how that changes the feel. In this particular game, I view the tire pressures, based on my particular experience in testing with them, as very minor adjustments, not something that is, unless you make a huge change to the pressures, you're probably not going to get a huge change in the feel of the car. So very much a minor adjustment if you're looking for that type of adjustment. Moving on now to the miscellaneous settings, we're using maximum spacing on both the left rear and the right rear. If you feel like the car is just too tight, particularly from the center of the corner on exit, then drop this number down to a 14.0 or even getting down to the 13.5 minimum. On the other hand, if you feel like the car is just too loose overall or unstable that it's gotten so free, then drop the right rear spacing number to around 18.5 or even lower, and that will certainly tighten the car up and give it a lot more stability. Brake bias isn't something I use a whole lot. Maybe a quick stab of the brakes here, just very light pressure on entry just to help the car to rotate the proper amount so that I can hit the apex that I need in the center. But for me, 55% works pretty well. I have used much higher numbers, up around 65 or 70%. Those can also work as just depending on how you're driving the car. Some people will need a lower value here, which will help the car to rotate more on entry, or a higher number, which will help tighten the car up a little bit as you apply the brakes. It all depends on how your preferred style of driving the car, what it needs, and how you need to go about making this adjustment. For me, 55 to 60% generally works best in most cases. Wheel lock is at 10 degrees, although there are plenty of circumstances where I would generally lower this because I want a little bit slower feel out of the wheel. I don't need very quick reactions because I use the remainder of the setup to get the car to rotate the way I need, so I don't really need the steering wheel to do that for me. So for that reason, I generally use a lower number than the 16 to 18 that the developers generally use by default. So anywhere from 8 to 10 degrees is generally my preference, but if you want a quicker feel out of the steering wheel, quicker reactions from your steering input, then use something like the default values of 16 to 18 or so, and that will certainly change the handling of the car. Then we come down to the steering offset and the stagger, which are very much related. They are tied really hand in hand. Here I'm using maximum stagger of 20.0, a very much a departure from what we saw at Arrowwood, where I was using around 11 to 13 for this very same stagger. Here, the 20 inches is meant to help the car rotate all the time. Because this track is so short, you spend so much time preparing for entry and then trying to get through the center and exit that I wanted the car to basically turn the entire time around the track and basically drive itself through the corners as much as possible. That's why I'm using maximum stagger. However, if you feel like the car is just out of control, it's just too loose, it pulls too hard to the left at all times, then drop this stagger number to something closer to what we saw at Arrowwood, something like 13, 14, 15, somewhere in that range, and that will certainly stabilize the car, tighten up the car, and remove some of the rotation overall. Steering offset, I'm using 1.25 here. For a stagger of 20, I can usually get by with something up to about 1.75, but here, using a little bit less than that at 1.25 worked out better for me. But again, this is all personal preference. Finally, the rear end ratio. This is just meant to give you some sort of direction as to where I am. 5.4 worked best for me. and got me really good lap times consistently, which is the main goal, is that consistency. But you can get by with a few clicks higher than this or a few clicks lower than this, again, just depending on your preferences. The more RPM you try to run, generally the looser the car will be. As you drop those RPMs by dropping this rear end ratio to 5.3, 5.2, and so on, then you'll generally tighten the car up. So this is just one more way of loosening or tightening the car based on what you need from the car. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing.